Hey, this is Chris Monk at Highline Guitars, and you're watching episode 59 From the Luthier's Workbench. In this episode, I'm going to give you an update on a couple of the guitars that I'm currently working on. And I'm going to also talk about Rosewood and what is going on with that. But first, let's do a quick update here. If you'll remember, I did a guitar in a couple of episodes ago where I was talking about how I like to paint and clear coat my guitars. And that was the guitar that had a red center and a kind of a purple burst to it. Kind of an interesting color combination. Well, by the time I was finished with that video and following all the takes that I did, showing different angles and such, I ended up with so much finish on the guitar that I felt it was just too thick. And I like to try to keep my finishes as thin as I can get them. But in this case, it just got so thick that I could actually tell just by handling the guitar. I also noticed that when I tried to put the control cavity cover on, there was so much finish on both, it no longer fit. So I put that guitar aside, and then I decided I was going to go back to it and strip off that finish, take it all the way back down to the bare wood. And from that point, I would decide how I was going to proceed with it. Now, oftentimes, when I'm building one of my spec guitars that I'm going to sell up on Reverb, I really don't know how I'm going to finish it. Sometimes I'll do a stain or I'll do a dye. Sometimes I'll paint them. It just depends on a particular situation, whatever is inspiring me at the moment. And it ends up being a situation where who knows where it's going to wind up. And so after I stripped the finish off, what I did was I went back in and I did I wiped down the entire surface with Danish oil. Now, when I use Danish oil, there's a couple of reasons why I like to use it. First of all, after sanding down to the bare wood, or actually, let's step back a little bit. After stripping the finish off, there were marks in the wood left over from the process of stripping the wood. And the way I strip it is I use a heat gun, heat up that finish, and then take a scraper and scrape it off. And that can oftentimes scratch and mar the surface. So once that's done, I sanded the entire surface with 150 and 220 grit sandpaper. Then I applied the Danish oil over the top, and I'm using Wattcoat Danish oil, and I think it's the Fruitwood color. And what that does is it helps to reveal flaws in the surface of the wood that you might not normally see in the bare wood with the naked eye. If there are scratches, excessive scratches, when you apply that Danish oil, those scratches will get darker and they jump out at you, and you can see where you may have a problem with scratches. So all you have to do is let that Danish oil dry for a day or two, and then go back and work on just those areas. And in this case, this being a carved top, I had some issues with a lot of scratches concentrated where the top is carved down into this level portion down here around the edge. So what I did was, after the Fruitwood Danish oil had dried, I went back with a curved scraper and I just scraped those areas and removed those scratches, and then just lightly sanded over the top with some 220 grit sandpaper. Then I applied a fresh coat of the Danish oil, and then I started going around the outer edge with burnt umber artist oil paint straight out of the tube. I would just rub it on all the way around the edge and then kind of feather it off into the finish. And what I was going for is kind of a rustic, sort of a tobacco stain, burst stain effect. And again, I have no idea really where it was going to wind up. I just started applying it, and by rubbing in that burnt umber and then going over the edge where it blends lightly with a clean rag soaked with mineral spirits, I was able to get an effect that I think is going to look pretty cool. Now at this point, I'm just going to let it dry thoroughly for the next couple of days. at which point I'll go over the top with a polyurethane varnish just to seal it and to protect the surface. And the neck for this guitar is already finished, and it's basically a laminate of flame maple and walnut with a maple fretboard. And that's been stained with, again, that burnt umber, creating this kind of a blend effect. Just something different. I think it's kind of cool looking. And then over the top of that, I went over it with the polyurethane varnish, let that dry, and I sanded it so that it's nice and smooth and doesn't have that sticky feel to it. It's already been fretted, it's ready to go. All it needs is for the body to catch up to it. The next guitar that I'm working on this is another carved top that I'm working on. And the top is ash, the back is mahogany. And what I did was, in this case, I mixed up some dark reddish brown water-based acrylic craft paint, and I wiped it over the entire surface and then let that dry. Then once it was dry, I went back over the top and sanded it smooth. And that removed most of that dark reddish brown color, except for in the grain. So as you can see, the grain really pops out pretty nicely. And the back I left pretty much just as is. But then what I did was I went over the top of it with Danish oil. And the reason for that, again, is to check my progress to make sure that there aren't any excessive tool marks or scratches in the surface, which there weren't in this case. But it also tints the wood a color, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to fill the grain with a clear grain filler, and I use Aqua Coat wood grain filler. And then I'll sand that smooth, and then I'll go over the top with I'm going to use an oil-based polyurethane varnish, because what that does is it keeps that warm glow to it. So that's what I'm going to do with this body. And then this is the neck that I made for it. This is quarter sawn Eastern Rock maple, and it has a little bit of figure in it, not a whole lot, but once I had it carved and sanded, I applied a stain over the top of it. And then what I'm going to do is just over the back part of the neck and the headstock, I'm going to apply my polyurethane varnish to protect it, to seal it, and I'll sand it probably to about 1500 grit, which is what I did with this neck, so that it has a nice smooth feel. And I like the neck to have that smooth feel where your hand just slides up and down, but I do like to have just a tiny bit of grab so that my hand doesn't slide too much. I don't like it super slippery. I like it to be smooth, but I like it to, if I want to stop and really hold, my hand won't slide too much. So that is where things stand at the moment. This is the different control cavity covers, my nameplates, one of the truss rod slot covers. So I expect that these guitars will probably be finished and up for sale on Reverb, hopefully the end of next week. It's hard to say for sure, but I'm looking at probably around the end of the month of June to beginning of the month of July 2017. So we'll see how that goes. Okay, so the next topic, rosewood. What is up with that? Okay, specifically what I'm talking about is you've probably heard that certain species of rosewood are becoming increasingly difficult to get a hold of. One particular species, which is beloved by luthiers, is Brazilian rosewood. And that is a species of wood which is on the CITES Appendices 1, which means forget about it. You can only get wood from trees which have fallen in the forest naturally, stumps, sinker logs, which are rosewood logs that were thrown into like the Amazon River and they sank. So they go back in and they pull those logs out. But you can't go into a forest in Brazil and cut down a Brazilian rosewood tree and harvest the lumber from it. If you do, you're going to get into big trouble. And people still do it, but that's poaching and, not a good thing. So other species of rosewood, mostly the Dalbergia species, are now on the CITES Appendice 2, which means it's under a great deal more control in terms of harvesting and distribution. Now, CITES is the convention for international trade of exotic species or endangered species. Convention for International Trade of Endangered Species. And what that is it's an international organization recognized by countries all over the world, set up to protect a wide variety of different species, wildlife species, flora and fauna, everything. And what they do is they will look at a particular species, and if it's under a lot of pressure for harvesting, they'll put it on one of three different appendices. There's appendices 1, 2, and 3. 1 is the most severe and most extreme controlled. 2 is more of a, we need to watch these species because they're under pressure and could be endangered. And appendices 3 is, we need to be aware of it, but we're not really going to control it yet. So the rosewoods have hit appendices 2. And of course, as I said before, Brazilian rosewood is on appendices 1, so it's really hard to get. Well, once a wood is moved from appendices 3 to appendices 2, it becomes increasingly difficult to get a hold of. It becomes more expensive. And then as any kind of manufacturer, whether you're furniture or musical instruments, you have to have documentation for the wood if you're using one of those species. And believe me, you've got to have documentation even if you're using a species of wood that is not recognized or governed by CITES. You have to pretty much cross your T's and dot your I's, because the folks in different countries and their customs departments can do pretty much whatever they want to do. And I've encountered this before. So you really have to be aware, if you're going to be selling your products internationally, you have to be aware of the laws and what's required and try to follow that. What it comes down to is the customs in different countries and individuals who work in those customs departments and how involved and enthusiastic and motivated they are to follow the rules. I've shipped guitars to some countries where they didn't even look to see what was in the box. Other countries, they tore open the box and examined it carefully and needed to know specifically what the different species of wood that was used in the guitar and what documentation I had. And I've had guitars actually seized by customs. And it happened because I built the guitar out of wood that is not listed on the CITES appendices. However, because the wood looked like an endangered species, they automatically assumed it was. And since I didn't have documentation for it, they kept the guitar. So you really have to be aware of this if you're going to be shipping your guitars around the world. Now, if you're a musician, and I've heard different horror stories about guitars being seized by customs and so on and so forth. So it's difficult to comment to that. But from what I understand, the way the United States views that rule is if you are carrying an instrument of your own, that you own, from one country to another, it weighs less than 22 pounds, they don't care. They're not going to look at it. They're not going to bother with it. But if you're shipping a lot of guitars to different countries, to other people who've purchased them, that's when they're going to start to look at it. So you need to be aware of this. And so really what it comes back to is with rosewood hitting appendices 2, it means it's going to get more expensive. And it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to get harder to find, because I've noticed that woods, the different rosewoods and the different ebonies, I can go into my local lumber supplier and they have plenty of it. It's expensive. Some of it is insanely expensive. Oh my God, $90 to $100 a board foot for some ebony. So what that does is it kind of encourages us to start looking in for other types of wood as a substitute. And I've the big manufacturers like Gibson, they're exploring other materials like Richlite, and I know a lot of people are trying so hard to promote Richlite as a good alternative, and it is a good alternative. It truly is. But to the consumer, it's not wood. It's not a real wood. And no matter what kind of makeup you put on that pig, it's still a pig. And as a result, I think if you want to go down that path, you're going to have a tough course to follow, trying to convince people that Richlite is a good alternative. But there are other woods. For example, when I'm looking for a dark, almost black wood to use as a fretboard, I liked, ebony. There's no substitute for real ebony, but because it's becoming so expensive, unless a customer is willing to pay that, what I'm starting to look at is it's a wood called cataloche, Katalox, pronounced cataloche, and that wood can look anything like anywhere from a rosewood to an ebony, depending on the tree it was cut from. But you can take wood like that, and with an application of some wood finishing oil like boiled linseed oil or tung oil, it can get pretty dark in color, almost jet black. So I like to use that. For rosewoods, I've found a couple of alternatives that I honestly prefer over traditional rosewood. One is, this is a wood, it's from, I believe it's from South America, called Chechen, and it looks very much like rosewood, but it always has some really cool looking grain in it, and it kind of reminds me of Cocobolo or Bocote, with one difference in that it is not as oily, so you don't have to wipe it down with acetone before gluing it to a neck. And it looks really good. I like the way it looks. It's a very, very hard, very dense wood, just like any rosewood is. Another one that I like if I want a straight grain, but want an absolute super smooth finish with no grain, no pores whatsoever. Pau Furrow, which is also known as Murado, which is also known as Bolivian rosewood. Now, even though it's rosewood maybe in the name, it's not a true rosewood. It's not a Dalbergia. It's a completely different species, and it is not controlled by CITES. Regardless, whether you're using East Indian rosewood or Pau Furrow or Chechen or Cataloche, you really need to have documentation from your supplier as to what that species is, and you need to include that if you're going to be shipping the guitar to a customer in another country, because if they open up that case and they see what they think is rosewood, they've got themselves a brand new guitar. So to avoid that, have the documentation and keep copies of it for yourself when you ship it off, so that if somebody in some weird little country decides to keep your guitar, you can show that you've got the documentation, the necessary paperwork to move that guitar through. So is it going to get any better? Well, it depends on us humans and how much we want to consume these woods without replenishing the forests. And I've read a lot of interesting science about how they're looking at ways of genetically modifying these species so that a tree can grow faster with less care, and so you could basically plantation grow rosewoods, ebonies, mahoganies, and so on. The problem with those woods now is that they just take so long to grow to a point where they can be harvested. And because of the demands that we place on those species, we tend to cut them all down before new forests can grow and replace them. So, but that's really what I wanted to talk about today in this episode. And who knows what will be coming up in episode 60. I think, however, it may be a little bit of time before I get to that, because I'm in the summer months now, and this is when I'm really going to start building a lot of guitars and getting them out there. And so I'm not going to have this kind of time to stand around and yap into my camera. So, but between now and then, hope you get into the shop and get some guitar work done. And as always, if you have any questions or comments, just post them down below, and I'll try to respond to them. And also, always click on the show more in all my videos, because I usually include links for different things. So I'll probably put some links for some of the finishing products that I'm using, as well as a link to the CITES website, where you can actually search species to see if they're endangered. So until next time, have a great day.